Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's session. I'm excited to have you here as we delve into the fascinating world of psychology. Today, we'll be exploring the first part of our course, titled Introduction to Psychology. Specifically, we'll be focusing on Unit 3, which covers perception, its meaning, the laws governing it, perceptual constancies, and the factors that influence how we perceive the world around us. This overview will help us understand how our mind interprets sensory information and shapes our reality. So, let's get started and discover the intriguing aspects of perception together. Understanding how we interpret and organize the world around us is a fundamental aspect of psychology. On this slide, we're focusing on perception, how our brain makes sense of the sensory information we constantly receive. The world around us is full of sights, sounds, smells, and textures, creating an endless stream of sensory input. Sensation is simply about receiving this raw data, but perception is what transforms that raw information into meaningful experiences. It involves selecting, organizing, and interpreting what we sense so we can understand our environment. Perception is crucial because it helps us respond appropriately to what's happening around us. For example, if we hear a sound, sensation detects it. Perception then recognizes that sound as music or speech, giving it context and meaning. Without perception, all sensory data would be meaningless noise. This process is vital for our daily functioning, recognizing faces, crossing busy streets safely, understanding language, and making decisions. It also explains why different people might interpret the same event differently, because perception is subjective. Our individual experiences, expectations, and biases shape how we perceive the world. Ultimately, perception acts as the bridge connecting the external world with our internal understanding, enabling us to navigate and make sense of our environment effectively. Understanding how we interpret and organize the world around us is fundamental to psychology. On this slide, we focus on perception, which is essentially how we make sense of sensory information. We'll explore what perception really means and the processes involved in transforming raw sensory data into meaningful experiences. We'll look at the connection between sensation, attention, and perception, and see how these elements work together to shape our understanding of reality. You'll also learn about Gestalt laws, which explain how our minds organize stimuli into coherent patterns and structures. Perceptual constancies are another key concept. They help us maintain a stable view of the world, even when sensory input changes. And we'll examine environmental and psychological factors like motivation, expectations, and culture, which influence how we perceive things. Why is studying perception so important? Well, perception is central to how we experience reality. It helps explain why we sometimes see illusions or make errors in judgment. Plus, understanding perception has practical applications in education, advertising, therapy, and design, all aimed at better understanding human behavior. In summary, perception acts as a bridge between sensation and cognition. It transforms sensory input into meaningful awareness. Through this unit, you'll gain insight into how we perceive, interpret, and organize the world around us, which is essential for understanding human experience. In this slide, we are focusing on the objectives of this unit, which is part of our Introduction to Psychology course, specifically Unit 3 on perception. By the end of this unit, you'll be able to understand several key concepts. First, you'll learn to define perception itself, understanding it as a process of organizing and interpreting sensory information rather than just passive reception. Next, we'll explore the process of perception, breaking it down into stages like selection, where our brain picks out relevant stimuli, organization, where it arranges this information, and interpretation, which gives meaning to what we perceive. We'll also differentiate between sensation, simply receiving stimuli, and perception, which is about interpreting those stimuli to make sense of our environment. Understanding Gestalt principles is another important point. These principles explain how we naturally perceive patterns and whole forms, rather than just isolated parts, helping us see the bigger picture. We'll look into perceptual constancies, such as size, shape, and color constancy, which help us perceive objects consistently despite changes in viewing conditions, maintaining stability in our perception. The role of attention is also crucial. It's what filters and selects stimuli, allowing us to focus on what's relevant and perceive meaningfully in a busy world. Finally, we'll examine various factors that influence perception, including motivation, emotion, past experiences, cultural background, and expectations. All these elements shape how and what we perceive, making perception a dynamic and complex process that connects deeply to our overall understanding of human behavior and experience. Welcome to our discussion on perception. As we go through this slide, I want to highlight how perception helps us understand the world around us. The environment is full of stimuli, sounds, colors, movements, sensations that constantly bombard our senses. Our sense organs collect this raw data, but it's through perception that our mind makes sense of it all. Perception is essentially a psychological process. It involves selecting, organizing, and interpreting sensory information so we can form a clear and coherent picture of our environment. This process is crucial because it helps us act effectively and adapt to new or changing situations around us. Now, an important point to remember is that perception is subjective. That means the same stimulus can be perceived differently by different people. For example, in The Little Prince, we see how adults and children interpret the same drawing quite differently. This difference stems from personal experience, mindset, and individual differences. Understanding these variations in perception helps us see why people might see, judge, or react in unique ways, even when faced with identical situations. It's a reminder that perception is deeply personal and influenced by many factors, which ties back to the overall theme of how we make sense of our world. Let's talk about perception as a bridge between sensation and thought. Think of sensation as the raw input our senses gather from the environment, like sights, sounds, and smells. Perception, then, acts as the link that takes this raw data and organizes it into meaningful experiences. Without perception, all this sensory information would just be a jumble of unconnected data, kind of like hearing a bunch of sounds but not understanding what they mean. Understanding perception is really important in psychology because it helps us explain how we recognize objects and events around us. It also sheds light on why we sometimes experience perceptual errors or illusions, those moments where what we see or hear doesn't quite match reality. Additionally, our personality, motivation, and even our cultural background influence how we interpret what we perceive. So, perception isn't just about passive reception. It's about actively constructing our version of reality, which isn't always the same as the world itself. To sum up, perception is a dynamic, interpretive process. It transforms raw sensations into meaningful experiences, allowing us to understand and respond to our environment. It also explains why different people can interpret the same situation in unique ways, highlighting the rich complexity of human experience. Perception is a fascinating process that helps us understand the world around us. It's not just about sensing things, but about how we select, organize, and interpret the sensory information we receive. This means that perception involves awareness and understanding, allowing us to make sense of our environment. When we perceive, we're actually constructing a mental picture of the world, and that picture influences how we think and act. For example, if we see an approaching vehicle, our perception tells us there might be danger, and we respond by stepping aside. This shows how perception directly impacts our reactions and decisions. In our daily lives, perception plays a crucial role. It helps us adapt to our surroundings and interact effectively with others. Whether we're driving, studying, or communicating, our perceptions guide our decisions and problem-solving. It's also the foundation for learning and changing our behavior, since our responses depend on how we interpret stimuli. It's important to remember that perception isn't the same for everyone. Different people perceive the same situation in unique ways, which is why no two individuals experience the world exactly alike. This variability highlights the complex and personal nature of perception in shaping our understanding of the world. Perception is not just a single moment. It's a continuous process that unfolds in 3 key stages. First, we have selection, where our brain chooses specific stimuli from all the environmental input to focus on. This is crucial because our senses are constantly bombarded with information, but we can't pay attention to everything at once. Next comes organization, which involves arranging the selected stimuli into a structured and meaningful whole. Our mind automatically groups related elements to help us make sense of what we're experiencing. Finally, there's interpretation, where we assign meaning to that organized information based on our previous experiences, the current context, and our expectations. Now, let's talk about the characteristics of perception. It's inherently subjective, meaning it's influenced by our individual experiences, motives, and emotions. What one person perceives might be different from another because of these personal factors. Perception is also selective. Our attention naturally filters what we focus on, so we only notice certain aspects of our environment. It's organized as well. Our brain automatically groups stimuli to create a coherent picture. And importantly, perception is active and dynamic. It changes as we gain new information or have new experiences. In summary, perception acts as a gateway to understanding the world around us. It helps us interpret sensory input and respond in meaningful ways. Essentially, it transforms external stimuli into psychological experiences, enabling us to function, communicate, and survive effectively. Perception is not just a single moment. It's actually a process that happens in stages. These stages work together to help us understand and interpret the sensory information we receive from our environment. So, the process involves several interconnected steps, starting from what we notice to how we make sense of it all. The 3 main stages are selection, organization, and interpretation. Let's start with the first stage, selection. Our environment is filled with countless sensory stimuli all the time, but our brain can't process everything happening around us. So, it has to pick and choose what to focus on. This selection is influenced by things like how intense a stimulus is, whether it's new or familiar, if it's repetitive, moving, or personally interesting to us. For example, think about sitting in a noisy classroom. Despite all the sounds, if someone calls your name, you'll probably hear it immediately. That's your brain's way of selectively paying attention to what matters most to you. In short, selection determines what we become aware of and what we ignore. Now, once the stimuli are selected, we move to the second stage, organization. This is where our mind takes those selected stimuli and arranges them into meaningful patterns or wholes. Our brain does this automatically, guided by some fundamental principles known as Gestalt principles, things like proximity, similarity, and closure. For instance, when we read, we don't see each letter separately. Instead, our brain groups the letters together to recognize entire words. It's a quick, subconscious process that helps us make sense of complex sensory information by creating organized wholes out of the parts. So, in summary, these stages, selection and organization, work together to filter and structure the raw sensory input, helping us interpret and understand our environment more effectively. Now, let's look at the final stage of perception, which is interpretation. This is where we assign meaning to the organized stimuli that we've already processed. Interpretation is heavily influenced by our past experiences, expectations, beliefs, motivation, and emotions. These factors shape how we understand what we see or experience. This is why 2 people can look at the same object or event and perceive it differently. For example, think about the duck-rabbit illusion. One person might see a duck, while another sees a rabbit. Their mental focus or previous experiences influence what they perceive. It's important to understand that these stages, selection, organization, and interpretation, are interconnected and continuous. Perception isn't a static process, it's dynamic. Selection determines what information gets organized, and how that information is organized influences how we interpret it. So, perception is really a constant interaction between our senses and our mind. This process explains why different people can perceive the same situation in very different ways, depending on their unique perspectives and contexts. To sum up, perception involves progressing through these stages: selection, organization, and interpretation to filter sensory information and make sense of our environment. Despite receiving the same sensory input, our perceptions can vary widely across individuals and situations. Let's dive into the first main approach, the bottom-up approach, also known as direct perception. This idea was proposed by J.J. Gibson in 1966, and it's often called the ecological approach. The key idea here is that perception is primarily data-driven, meaning it comes directly from the sensory input we receive from our environment. In this view, the environment itself provides enough information for us to perceive objects and scenes without needing to rely on prior knowledge or mental inference. So, perception is considered objective, based purely on the physical properties of stimuli around us. For example, when you recognize a chair, you're doing so based on its structure and function, not because you remember seeing that specific chair before or expecting it to be a chair. This approach emphasizes immediate awareness of what's around us, rather than relying on mental interpretation or guesswork. It highlights how our sensory systems can pick up sufficient cues from the environment to perceive things directly and accurately. Now, let's explore the top-down approach to perception, also known as indirect perception. This approach was proposed by Richard Gregory in 1970 and is part of the constructivist perspective. It suggests that perception is primarily experience-driven. In other words, our brain actively constructs meaning based on past experiences, knowledge, and expectations. The sensory data we receive alone can often be ambiguous or unclear. So our brain steps in to fill in the gaps, helping us form a coherent understanding of what we're perceiving. This means that perception is subjective. It can sometimes lead us to errors or illusions, especially when our expectations or prior knowledge influence what we see or interpret. For example, you might recognize a blurred face because it resembles someone familiar, or interpret an ambiguous figure based on the context around it. These are cases where our brain is using prior information to make sense of incomplete or unclear sensory input. Now, it's important to understand that modern psychology recognizes that perception isn't solely bottom-up or top-down. Instead, it involves a dynamic integration of both processes. Sensory input provides the raw data, the bottom-up part, while our prior knowledge and expectations offer context and meaning, the top-down part. This combination allows us to perceive the world more accurately and adaptively, especially in everyday situations filled with complexity and ambiguity. To summarize, perception isn't just about what we sense or what we think. It's a continuous interaction between stimulus information and our mental interpretation. This balance enables us to make sense of our environment efficiently, even when the information is incomplete or confusing. Let's now look at sensation and its process. Sensation is actually the very first step in perception. It involves detecting physical energy from our environment through our sensory organs. Think of it as our body's way of gathering raw data from the world around us. It's a physiological process, meaning it happens within our bodies, and it provides the basic information that our brain will later interpret. The sense organs act as receptors, specialized cells that convert environmental stimuli like light, sound, or pressure into neural impulses. These impulses are then transmitted to the brain for further processing. It's important to understand that sensation alone doesn't give us understanding or meaning. It simply makes us aware that something is happening, like feeling a touch or hearing a sound, without yet knowing what it is. Now, let's explore the relationship between sensation and perception. These two processes are closely connected but serve different functions. Sensation is all about detecting stimuli. Think of it as the input process. Perception, on the other hand, is interpretive. It's about giving meaning to what we've sensed. For example, when light hits your retina, your eyes detect that light. This is sensation. But recognizing that the light is coming from a flower, that's perception. So sensation provides the foundation, the raw data, while perception is what transforms that data into meaningful experience. In summary, sensation is the first step, detecting stimuli, while perception is the process of interpreting those stimuli to understand what we are experiencing. Let's explore the sensation and its process. When we talk about sensation, we're referring to how our senses detect physical energy from the environment. For example, our eyes detect light, our ears pick up sound waves, and our taste buds or smell receptors respond to chemicals. Each sense organ has specialized receptors designed for specific types of stimuli, which helps us gather accurate information from our surroundings. Once this physical energy is detected, the next step is transduction. This is where the energy is transformed into electrochemical signals or neural impulses that our brain can understand. Think of it as translating raw sensory input into a language that the brain can interpret for us to make sense of what we're experiencing. After transduction, these neural impulses are transmitted via sensory nerves to the relevant areas of the brain. For example, visual information travels through the optic nerve from the retina to the occipital lobe, which is primarily responsible for processing visual data. This transmission is crucial for our perception because it delivers the information to the brain for further analysis. Now, let's look at some characteristics of sensation. First, sensation is automatic and immediate. It happens naturally and instantly when our sense organs are stimulated. It's biological, meaning it relies on the proper functioning of our sensory receptors and nervous system. Importantly, sensation itself is raw and unprocessed. It doesn't carry any meaning until perception kicks in. Additionally, sensation can vary from person to person because some individuals may have heightened or diminished sensory sensitivity. Why is sensation so important in perception? Because sensation provides the raw material, the basic data, that our brain uses to construct our experience of the world. If our sensory processes are inaccurate or impaired, perception can become distorted, leading to mistakes or illusions. Ultimately, the efficiency and accuracy of our sensory processes directly influence how clearly and correctly we perceive our environment, shaping our overall experience of reality. Let's explore the role of attention in perception. Attention, as you might know, is the process of focusing our mental energy on specific stimuli while ignoring others. Think of it as a sort of mental spotlight that helps us zero in on what's important. It acts as a selective filter, meaning it decides which sensory inputs actually make it to our conscious awareness. Without attention, our minds would be flooded with sensory information, making perception chaotic and overwhelming. That's why attention is really the first step toward having clear, organized perception. Now, how does attention relate to perception? Well, perception actually only begins once attention has selected certain stimuli from the environment. It helps us not just to pick out relevant information, but also to maintain focus on it and shift that focus as needed. For example, when you're in a noisy room and suddenly hear your name, that's a perfect illustration of the cocktail party effect. It shows how our attention can be selective enough to pick out something meaningful, even among a lot of irrelevant noise. Moving on to the types of attention, there are mainly two important kinds to understand. First is selective attention, which is when you concentrate on one particular stimulus while ignoring everything else. Imagine you're reading a book in a busy cafe. Your focus on the text helps block out all the background noise. The second type is sustained attention, which is about maintaining focus on a task over an extended period. For instance, an air traffic controller needs to continuously monitor aircraft signals without losing focus. That's sustained attention in action. So, in summary, attention plays a crucial role in perception by helping us filter, select, and focus on relevant stimuli. It's what allows us to perceive the world in an organized way, prioritizing what matters most for our goals and needs. Let's explore the role of attention in perception. Attention is influenced by two main categories of factors: external or objective factors and internal or subjective factors. External factors include things like the intensity and size of a stimulus, so how loud or big something is. It also involves novelty or movement, meaning new or moving stimuli tend to grab our attention more easily. Contrast and changes in the environment also play a big role. Anything that stands out because of difference or shift. On the other hand, internal factors are more personal. Our motives, needs, emotions, interests, and habits all influence what we pay attention to. Our previous experiences and mental set, that is, our current mindset, also shape where our focus goes. All of these factors work together to determine what captures our attention and what we hold on to. Now, why is attention so important in perception? First, it helps ensure that what we interpret from our senses is clear and accurate. It acts like a filter, preventing us from becoming overwhelmed by too much sensory input, filtering out what's unnecessary. Attention also boosts our ability to learn, remember, and make decisions effectively. And importantly, it plays a crucial role in our adaptation and survival. By focusing on relevant cues in our environment, we can respond appropriately and stay safe. So, in summary, attention is a key process that shapes how we perceive and interact with the world around us. Now, let's take a closer look at the Gestalt laws of perceptual organization. These laws help us understand how our mind organizes what we see into meaningful patterns. Starting with the introduction to Gestalt psychology, it was developed by Wertheimer, Koehler, and Kafka in 1912. They emphasized that the whole is different from just the sum of its parts. That is, our perception isn't just a collection of isolated elements. Instead, we naturally tend to organize sensory input into coherent and unified patterns. The word Gestalt itself means form or configuration, highlighting this idea of perceiving whole structures rather than just pieces. These laws are crucial because they explain how we make sense of complex visual environments by grouping elements in certain ways. Now, one of the major laws is the law of figure, ground. This law states that every perception divides the visual field into two parts: the figure, which is the focus of our attention, and the ground, which is the background. For example, think of Rubens' vase illusion. Sometimes you see a vase, and other times you see two faces. This switch depends on what your mind selects as the figure and what becomes the background. So, this law shows how our perception actively organizes visual information into distinct elements, making sense of what we see. Now, let's explore the law of proximity, which is one of the Gestalt laws of perceptual organization. Essentially, this law tells us that objects which are close to each other are perceived as part of the same group. For example, if you look at a series of dots arranged near one another, your mind naturally groups them together, and they appear as clusters or lines. This principle helps us make sense of complex visual scenes by organizing elements based on their spatial closeness. It's a fundamental way our perception simplifies the world around us, making it easier to interpret and understand what we see. This concept fits into the broader theme of perception by showing how our minds use simple cues like proximity to organize sensory information efficiently. Now, let's move on to the third law in Gestalt's laws of perceptual organization, which is the law of similarity. This law states that elements that look alike, whether in color, shape, or size, tend to be grouped together in our perception. Essentially, when we see objects that share common features, our mind naturally perceives them as part of the same group or pattern. For example, if you look at a pattern of alternating circles and squares, you'll notice that the similar shapes tend to form rows or columns. Our brain instinctively groups similar items to make sense of the visual scene more efficiently. This principle helps us quickly identify patterns and organize complex visual information into understandable units. The law of similarity is fundamental because it shows how our perception relies on visual features to create meaningful structures out of chaos. It's all about our mind's tendency to connect things that resemble each other, which plays a crucial role in how we interpret the world around us. Let's talk about the law of continuity, which is one of the key Gestalt laws of perceptual organization. Essentially, our mind prefers to see smooth, continuous patterns rather than abrupt or disconnected elements. This means that when we look at a series of points or lines, we tend to interpret them as part of a single, flowing shape rather than separate, unrelated segments. For example, if you see a curved line made up of many small points, your mind automatically perceives it as a continuous line rather than a bunch of disconnected dots along a curve. This preference for continuity helps us make sense of the visual world quickly and efficiently, connecting the dots, so to speak, and seeing objects as complete, unified forms rather than disjointed pieces. It's a fundamental principle that influences how we organize our perceptions and interpret complex visual scenes in everyday life. Now, let's talk about the law of closure. This law states that incomplete figures are perceived as complete or whole. Essentially, our minds tend to fill in the gaps when parts of a shape are missing. For example, if you see a broken circle, you still perceive it as a full circle. That's because our brain automatically fills in the missing parts, creating a sense of completeness. This tendency helps us interpret visual information efficiently and makes perception more seamless. It's a fascinating way in which our perceptual system organizes what we see, aligning with the overall theme of how our perception is influenced by innate laws that structure our experience of the world. Now, let's move on to the law of common fate. This law tells us that elements moving in the same direction are perceived as part of one group. For example, when you see a bunch of cars moving together on the road, your brain naturally groups them as a single unit. This principle highlights how movement helps us organize our perception by associating objects that move together. It's a crucial aspect of how we make sense of dynamic scenes in our environment. So, in essence, when elements share a common direction or movement, our perceptual system tends to see them as connected, which helps us interpret complex visual information more efficiently. This law is a perfect example of how motion influences our perception and helps us understand the world around us more clearly. Let's take a closer look at the law of good form, also known as Prägnanz. Essentially, this law tells us that we tend to perceive objects in their simplest, most stable and symmetrical form possible. Our minds have a natural preference for order and simplicity when interpreting what we see. This is really significant because these Gestalt principles explain how our brain automatically organizes raw sensory data into meaningful wholes. Instead of passively recording everything around us, perception is an active process, one where our mind interprets and simplifies what it receives. These principles aren't just theoretical. They form the foundation for many fields like design, art, visual communication, and user experience. Understanding how we naturally organize visual information helps us create more intuitive and effective designs. So, in essence, the Gestalt laws reveal that perception is a dynamic, interpretive process driven by our brain's preference for simplicity and order. Now, let's talk about perceptual constancy. This is a fascinating aspect of how we perceive the world around us. Despite the fact that our sensory inputs are constantly changing, like when an object moves or the lighting shifts, our brain tends to perceive objects as stable and unchanging. This ability is what we call perceptual constancy. It helps us maintain a consistent view of our environment, so things don't seem to flicker or change unpredictably. For example, imagine someone walking away from us. Their image on our retina gets smaller, right? But even though the retinal image shrinks, we still perceive their actual size as the same. That's perceptual constancy in action. It's what allows us to interact with the world smoothly and reliably. Now, why is this important? Well, perceptual constancy provides stability, accuracy, and predictability in how we perceive our surroundings. It helps us make sense of what we see so that our perceptions are coherent and continuous. This ability is crucial for making accurate judgments about distance, movement, and size in real life. Most importantly, perceptual constancy plays a vital role in adaptive behavior. It ensures that, despite the constant sensory variations we experience, our perception remains organized and dependable. This way, we can navigate and respond to our environment effectively, maintaining a clear and reliable understanding of the world around us. Now, let's talk about the major types of perceptual constancy. The first one is size constancy. This is the phenomenon where objects are perceived as having a constant size, even though their retinal image changes depending on how far away they are. For example, a car seen from a distance looks smaller on our retina, but we still recognize it as a full-sized car. This perceptual stability is maintained through our experience. the context in which we see the object, and depth cues that help us judge distance. Moving on to shape constancy, this refers to the way we perceive the shape of an object as remaining the same, even when the angle from which we view it changes. Think about a door. Whether it's open or closed, we still see it as rectangular. Our brain corrects for the changes in the retinal image based on what we know about the shape of the object, allowing us to perceive a consistent shape regardless of the viewing angle. Both of these constancies are essential for our perception of a stable and predictable world, despite the constantly changing images on our retina. They highlight how our brain actively interprets sensory information to maintain perceptual stability. Let's take a closer look at perceptual constancies, starting with color or brightness constancy. This concept refers to how the color or brightness of an object appears to stay the same, even when lighting conditions change. For example, a white shirt looks white whether you're in sunlight or shade. Our mind actively adjusts for differences in illumination, helping us perceive consistent colors regardless of the lighting environment. Now, what supports this constancy? Well, experience and learning play a big role. Our past knowledge helps us recognize the true properties of objects, no matter how the lighting might alter their appearance. Context cues are also crucial. Surroundings and background information help us maintain a stable perception of an object's size and shape. And let's not forget binocular vision and depth perception. These help us judge distances and sizes accurately, even when viewed from different angles. So, why are perceptual constancies significant? They showcase the incredible efficiency of our perceptual system. Perception isn't just about passively receiving sensory information. It's about actively interpreting and correcting what we see. This ability enables us to navigate the world smoothly and accurately, despite constant changes in lighting, distance, and perspective. It highlights how our brain works behind the scenes to keep our perceptions stable and reliable. Let's take a closer look at the factors that influence perception. As we've discussed, perception is not purely objective. It's shaped by various psychological and environmental factors. Essentially, what we perceive depends both on the nature of the stimulus itself and our internal state of mind. Now, focusing on the psychological factors, 3 major ones come to mind: motivation, expectation, and emotion. These factors significantly alter how we select and interpret sensory information. Starting with motivation, our needs, desires, and drives, they play a crucial role. When we're motivated, we tend to notice stimuli that are related to our goals or needs more readily. For example, if someone is hungry, they're more likely to quickly notice food-related cues around them. Motivation heightens our awareness of relevant stimuli and can even cause us to ignore what's irrelevant. It's like internal drives guiding our attention and shaping our perception. Next is expectation, which is also known as perceptual set. This is basically our mind's readiness to perceive a stimulus in a particular way based on our past experiences or beliefs. Expectations act as a filter, shaping how we interpret ambiguous or unclear stimuli. For example, in the famous study by Brunner and Minturn in 1955, an ambiguous figure could be seen as either a letter B or the number 13, depending on the context or what we expect to see. So, our expectations influence how we make sense of what we perceive, aligning our perception with prior knowledge and assumptions. In summary, perception is a complex process influenced by internal factors like motivation and expectation, which help us interpret the world around us, often in ways that are shaped by our needs, desires, and beliefs. Let's talk about factors affecting perception, specifically emotions. Our emotional states have a powerful influence on how we perceive and interpret the world around us. For example, if someone is feeling fearful, angry, or happy, these emotions can either distort or enhance what they see and understand. Imagine an anxious person who might see a shadow and interpret it as a threat, whereas a cheerful person might see the same shadow as harmless. This shows how emotional tone can really color our perception, shaping not just what we see, but how we respond to our environment. Now, understanding these psychological factors is important because it highlights that perception isn't just a passive reflection of reality. Instead, it's active and personal, meaning different people can interpret the same situation in very different ways. This is especially relevant in fields like advertising, counseling, and education, where perception influences decisions, opinions, and behaviors. Recognizing how emotions and other psychological factors shape perception helps us better understand human responses and improve how we communicate and interact. Let's now look at some of the external factors that influence perception. Besides what's happening inside us, like our motivation or emotions, perception is also shaped by the outside world, specifically, the properties of stimuli and our past experiences. Environmental cues and cultural contexts play a crucial role in how we attend to and interpret sensory input. The major external factors influencing perception include stimulus characteristics, our previous experiences, and cultural backgrounds. Now, focusing on stimulus characteristics, these are physical properties of a stimulus that naturally draw our attention and influence how we perceive things. Some key features to remember are intensity, novelty, movement, and contrast or change. For example, when a light is brighter or a sound is louder, they stand out more and grab our attention. Unusual or unexpected stimuli, like something new or surprising, tend to catch our eye first. Moving objects are also more noticeable than stationary ones because movement signals importance or urgency. Additionally, differences like color or shape, or sudden changes in the environment, help us quickly perceive what's important or potentially threatening. These objective features are essential because they help us stay aware of important stimuli and respond appropriately. So, in essence, these physical properties help our perception adapt to our surroundings and focus our attention where it's needed most. Let's explore how factors like experience and learning influence our perception. Perception isn't just a passive process. It's something we learn over time through our experiences. We interpret the world based on what we already know, which helps us predict, categorize, and recognize stimuli more efficiently. For example, if someone once mistook a rope for a snake, they might be extra alert to similar shapes in the future. Sometimes, our past experiences can even lead to perceptual biases or illusions, showing how deeply our learning shapes what we perceive. This highlights that perception is a cognitive process, heavily influenced by our memory and familiarity. Now, moving on to culture and social background. Our cultural upbringing plays a significant role in how we interpret stimuli. It shapes our values, symbols, and meanings, which can vary greatly across societies. Think about hand gestures, like a thumbs up or a circle. What's a positive sign in one culture can be offensive in another. People from different cultural backgrounds tend to focus on different features of the same scene or stimulus, which means perception isn't universal, but socially and culturally constructed. Finally, it's important to understand that in real life, perception results from the interaction of these internal and external factors. The same object or event might be perceived differently depending on the context, our mood, or prior experiences. Recognizing how these influences interact helps us better understand why people interpret messages, objects, or social situations in unique ways. This interconnected view emphasizes that perception is a complex, dynamic process shaped by multiple factors working together. Let's now look at the summary and key takeaways from this unit on perception. First, understanding the meaning and nature of perception is essential. Perception is the process through which we select, organize, and interpret sensory input to create meaningful experiences. It transforms raw sensory data into a coherent awareness of our environment, which helps us function effectively in daily life. Remember, perception is subjective. It's influenced by both internal factors like our past experiences and external factors like the environment. This is why different people may perceive the same situation differently. Moving on to the stages of perception, there are 3 main steps we go through. The first is selection, where we focus on relevant stimuli among countless sensory inputs. Next is organization, where we arrange the sensory data into recognizable patterns or structures. Finally, interpretation involves assigning meaning based on the context, our prior experiences, and our expectations. These stages are ongoing and interconnected. They work together to shape our perceptual experience. Now, when we talk about theoretical approaches, there are two key perspectives. The bottom-up approach, proposed by Gibson, suggests that perception is direct and relies solely on sensory data. In contrast, Gregory's top-down approach emphasizes that perception is constructed using our prior knowledge and experiences. Modern research sees perception as a blend of both. It's data-driven but also concept-driven, which makes it a dynamic and complex process. Finally, let's consider the Gestalt laws of organization. The mind naturally tends to organize stimuli into meaningful wholes. Principles like figure ground, proximity, similarity, closure, and continuity help us perceive complete and organized images rather than disjointed pieces. These laws reveal that perception is active and structured, not random or fragmented. Overall, understanding these concepts helps us appreciate how perception shapes our understanding of the world around us, which is central to the entire study of psychology. Let's wrap up with some key takeaways from what we've learned about perception. Perception isn't just a passive process. It's active, interpretive, and deeply influenced by many factors. Perceptual constancies, such as size, shape, and color constancy, help us perceive a stable world even when sensory input changes. These constancies show how efficiently our perceptual system adapts to different conditions. Now, perception is affected by various factors. Psychological elements like motivation, expectations, and emotions play a big role. External factors like the properties of stimuli, our learning experiences, and cultural backgrounds also shape how we perceive things. Together, these factors influence what we notice, how we interpret it, and why perceptions can differ from person to person. The overall importance of perception cannot be overstated. It's crucial for our awareness, adaptation, and interaction with the world around us. It explains why different people can see the same situation in completely different ways, impacting communication, relationships, and decision-making. By understanding perception, we can improve many areas like education, therapy, design, and social interactions. And the key point to remember is that perception is not just a simple recording of stimuli. It's an active, meaning-making process that involves the interaction between sensory input, mental processes, and cultural context. This makes perception one of the most dynamic and vital areas of study in psychology. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you found this presentation helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed the content, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up like and hit the bell subscribe button so you never miss out on more amazing videos from us. We truly appreciate your support. This project was brought to you by Team Skills Sapphire, and we're excited to continue sharing valuable insights with you in the future. Thanks again for being here, and see you next time.